Hello, my friends. I've created this page so I can be able to share with you some of the most interesting things about insurance. So, this is my first video. So, what I'm going to try to do is like to teach and inform people about this beautiful subject of insurance. So, as we go on, I'll make some videos, and just in case you have some questions as far as insurance is concerned, you can put them in the comment section. I'm gonna try to answer them in the comment section. If I don't, if there are more questions, I might create a video to try to explain or answer a particular topic of interest. Without wasting much of your time, today's lesson, we're going to be talking about risk. Risk as in risk. So, risk is about outcomes, uncertainty about outcomes, which can be negative at times. What does that mean? Every time, everything we do, there's an element of risk in it. Walking outside, you can get hit by a car. You risk getting hit by a car. You risk being hit by lightning. You risk getting sick, catching COVID if you walk amongst people. That's just risk about it. But just because there's risk doesn't necessarily mean it has to happen. So then we get an interesting topic about, okay, there's risk out there. We all know that. But now what's relevance about it? And then it comes up in the most interesting part. You find the word probability. Most risk managers, insurance people, mathematicians, when they talk about probability, in common sense, most people, they talk about the possibility of something happening to you. When you're talking in common sense, we talk about possibility. The possibility that if I drive a car, I might fall in an accident. What's the difference between possibility and probability? The difference now is probability is mostly about mathematicians. They try to quantify it in that they'll say there's a chance, 40% chance of this thing happening. Or this, like if they say there's 100% chance that something will happen, that's like to say it will happen. But when you say 40%, and then you play with it, there's a chance it might not happen. See, there's a difference between probability and possibility. Probability now it becomes more quantified. So you can even see it. So some people, they'll use, if you're mathematically minded, they'll use a fraction like 0.4% this thing might happen. Or they say 3/4 chance it will happen. I like it when I'm watching weather news, they'll say a 40% chance of rain. When it's like 10% chance of rain, I know I can go do stuff. I don't change my plans. But when they say 80% chance it will rain, then you change your plans. That's probability. Okay. And then when you talk about risk, I'll be going back to risk all the time. Most of the things I'll talk about will be risk. So there's a word in insurance we call loss exposure. So loss exposure is a condition that presents the possibility of loss, whether or not an actual loss happens or not. We're all exposed to this loss. Like for instance, if you have a house, it might catch on fire. There's a possibility that you're exposed to the loss exposure of fire. That's a property loss exposure. And then there's liability loss exposure. Let's say, for instance, you have a chance somebody might sue you. Because that's how life is, right? People sue each other. So that's a liability exposure. And companies, sometimes have a personal or personnel exposure. Depending if you're a company, you have personal exposure, whereby one of your key employees might just decide to quit the next day. So, well, I'm done with you guys. I'm moving on. So you are exposed to losing personnel. That's a personnel exposure. As families, we have personal exposure, meaning to say your husband, your wife might die, your kids might die. And if you're exposed to that, maybe your husband was the only person who was working, it exhibits the problem itself, becomes bigger. But that's personal exposure. And then there's net income exposure. Everybody goes through this. Let's say, for instance, the breadwinner dies. You're exposed to losing that income. The same thing for companies. Let's say you're operating a trucking company. Your truck gets involved in an accident. You crash. That means you lose money. That's a loss exposure. That's the word, loss exposure. And then when we look at loss exposure, there's what you call elements of loss exposure. There are elements to it. Elements of loss exposure. So when we talk about loss exposure, we're looking at an asset exposed to the loss. An asset could be, as I said, you're in trucking business. You have a car that you use to do stuff. That is exposed to loss. So you take good care of it so it doesn't get damaged. And then you talk about the causes of loss. There will be things now when you're looking into it, trying to analyze this loss, the causes of loss. Fire is a cause of loss. Accident. When you're driving in the rain or it's foggy out there, something might happen. And then another element of loss exposure could be the consequences when the loss happens. So what happens? Okay. Somebody died. Your spouse was it? So you have to deal with the consequences of loss. And then as you go ahead, you find one interesting subject. It's like a hazard. What's a hazard? It's a condition that increases the frequency or severity of loss. So a hazard, how do I do this? It's a condition. What do I say? People driving too fast. Driving too fast is a hazard. Driving itself is dangerous, but if you're speeding, there's a hazard there of you getting chances now of getting an accident increases. Sometimes if you're just too young, teenagers driving, crazy, trying to show off. So there's a hazard to condition that increases. So when you talk about hazards, so now the hazards are divided into. It's not just the insurance people. They'll try to explain to you. This is what they call moral hazard. So a moral hazard, it's a condition that increases the frequency of loss. Remember I told you? Moral hazard, is a frequency because of people being dishonest. Dishonest people present what we call a moral hazard. Bad people doing bad things. It increases the moral hazard. Stealing. If you go back to Malawi, corruption. It's a moral hazard. People just don't have the good morals to do the right thing. And then there's another word, the most interesting thing. This is very different from the moral hazard. It's called moral hazard. So moral hazard is when people work, let's say for instance you have a company and you hire people who just don't care. As long as they get paid, life goes on. They talk bad to customers. That's a moral hazard. You can tell sometimes you go to a company, they're busy on the phone. I'm like, hello, I'm here. No, they don't even acknowledge you. I'm like, to them, they're only waiting for the day when they get paid. Once they get paid, life goes on. I'm like, where do you think this money comes from? That's a moral hazard. And then there's another hazard which is called physical hazard. So this is like a condition in the property itself. Like for instance, driving a car with bad brakes. That's a physical hazard. Remember the time I used to be like when truck drivers, they're trained to do what you call pre-trip before they start driving. They have to check the truck, make sure it's fine. The brakes are working right, the lights are on, and everything else to control physical hazard. And then the other one is like legal hazard. There's some places where people just sue each other. Why? They just want to make money. So, know that it's in some places, that's what people do. They just be suing each other. Like, really? And the courts, some places, they will just be awarding damages left, right, and center. That's a legal hazard. The chances of somebody suing you. There was a story, I remember somebody went to McDonald's to buy a coffee and then she burned herself. Well, you bought her coffee. Be careful. But she want money. I mean, it was more complicated than that. But sometimes you look at it like, are you kidding me? Legal hazard. Okay, so when you talk about risk again, there's now kinds of risks. This is the most interesting thing. You'll hear me talk about pure risk and speculative risk. What's pure risk? Okay. In life, there are risks. So pure risk is when there's only, in fact, there's 2 or 3 outcomes. There'll be a loss or no loss, but there's no gain. What does it mean? Let's say, for instance, you buy a house. All you want is your house not to be destroyed. Let's say to catch fire. It's your house. Should something happen to it, the only thing that can happen to it is bad things. If a good thing happens, but not really. It's just looking at either catch fire. That's what we're talking about. Be careful. Your parents are telling you, be careful out there. She's not trying to make you win something. She just don't want you to get hurt. That's pure risk. When you say be careful, it's dangerous out there. Be careful. Take good care of yourself. Let's say, for instance, don't catch COVID. You either don't catch COVID or you catch COVID. So the outcomes are either you're not going to catch COVID. Because you didn't catch COVID doesn't mean you win anything. Life goes on. You're fine. Life goes on. Oh, I got a dog here. I was almost stepping on him. So that's why I freaked. And the other one is speculative risk. So speculative risk now. Get me? There's a chance for a loss. And there's also a chance for no loss at all. But there's also a chance for gain. Like, for instance, you're going into business. When you're in business, you're dealing with speculative risk. You can make a lot of money, or you can lose everything, or well, you can just maintain business. Capital, you didn't lose anything, you didn't gain anything. That's speculative risk. Stocks, if you buy a stock on the stock market, you might gain, you might lose. That's speculative risk. So, like, for instance, but when you're dealing with these risks, you do them differently. Insurance doesn't do speculative risk. I'm not going to say, from the get-go, we can say that. But there was a time, if you remember 2008, they were trying to insure speculative risk. Derivatives, they called them. But I mean, this was insurance of speculative, which that's why it didn't end well. You know how it ended. And then risk can also be divided into like either subjective or objective. Subjective risk or objective risk. And objective risk. So subjective risk is mostly based on your opinions. Like, for instance, some people are scared to fly in airplanes because they think if they fly, man, that thing is just going to crash. And then when you're flying, especially, so some of you who like to fly, turbulence. When you hit turbulence, it doesn't mean the plane is going to crash, but sure, it scares the hell out of me sometimes. But we always get where we're going. So sometimes people think like, oh, I think I better drive. Driving is safer than flying because you think you're in control. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at the numbers, you're safer flying than driving. But when you think, some people think flying is dangerous because that's their opinion, though. You can't change them. So sometimes people make decisions on things like subjective risk. They'll drive to Florida on vacation because they don't want to fly. They take 20 hours to drive, 20 hours back driving. Very dangerous, but they believe it's safer than flying. Flying will take them for 2 hours, but no, flying is dangerous to them. And then there's objective risk. Objective risk now is based on reality, numbers. Like I've told you, if you look at the numbers, flying is safer than driving. So that's objective and subjective risk. And the final risk we're going to deal with is diversifiable and undiversifiable risk. Diversifiable risk. This is the risk that affects very few people or very few businesses or an individual. That's diversifiable risk. This is like, it only happened to one person. You can always, like for instance, risks that has to do with business, whatever kind of business it is. You can choose to just, I'm not going to deal with that business, I'll do something else because it's diversifiable. And diversifiable risks, it affects a lot of people at the same time. You can diversify, like an earthquake. Okay. So next time, in the next video, we're going to deal with risk and how to deal with it. So if you have any questions, put it in the comment section. We'll answer them next time. I'll answer them on comments or not. Thank you.